Hey everybody, this is Welding Eldon. Thanks for stopping by the channel. Today we are going to do a video on everything that you need to know before you start stick welding. So first things first, let's talk safety. In front of me here I've got myself a leather jacket. Now, leather is kind of your best friend when it comes to stick welding. It keeps a lot of the spatter out, keeps a lot of the heat off you, so I definitely recommend a leather. Leather's not your only option though, I will admit that right up front. There are other jackets out there that are advertised as flame resistant or flame proof. Usually kind of up on the shoulder around here they'll have a little FP or an FR to kind of denote that. Those are good, especially if you're working in a hot shop, but they do burn a lot easier than you'd think. I have a couple of jackets that I no longer have that I have burned one too many holes into and they were no longer good for me. So you do have some options, but all in all I definitely recommend a leather jacket. I've had this jacket for about 3 years now. It's still a great jacket versus the flame proof one, which usually lasts me about 3 months. So take that into consideration when you are buying a jacket. So make sure you have a jacket. Keep your body protected, keep your arms protected. The other thing that you need, and one of the most important things for any welder, is a weld helmet. This one here that I use, mine is an ESOB model. It is the Sentinel A50. And I love this helmet. I really actually do like this helmet. It's been a very good helmet for me, for my career. It's got a very clean sight picture. It auto darkens fast. It's very reliable. It's a great helmet to have. It's a great helmet to use, and I recommend it for anyone who's looking to get into it. One thing that I do have to admit about these helmets up front though, it can get very expensive when you're replacing all of these cover lenses. So for the most part, I tell people if you're going to be TIG welding exclusively, this is your helmet. It also does great for stick and all the other processes, but these consumables do get kind of pricey, and all in all, it is actually a fairly heavy helmet in comparison. So think about that. That will be hanging off your head. The other brands that I like the most are Miller and Lincoln for welding helmets. There's a couple more out there. The main point when you're getting a welding helmet is make sure that it works and works correctly. What I mean by that is there are some kind of off-brand helmets that you can get that will say auto darkening, but when you flip them down and go to strike an arc, there's like a second delay or so. So there's that second there where it doesn't darken quite fast enough that you're just trying to blind yourself with. So watch out for helmets like that. And that's the reason why I like sticking with known, tried and true, tested brands like Miller, Lincoln, and ESOB. There are many others out there. You are free to check them out if you wish, but this is what I will be using for the majority of these videos. Next thing that you're going to want, gloves. We are stick welding. Stick welding is notorious for throwing sparks, so make sure you got yourself a good set of gloves. These are a good set of leather gloves, and I have used these quite a lot, as referenced, by the many holes in the fingers. I've used these gloves quite a bit, but they still work pretty well for stick welding, even despite the holes. You'll notice they're a little bit thicker leather. They got some long cuffs on them. Those will be nice for helping to keep sparks out when you're stick welding, give you a little bit of defense there. Some of the other gloves that you're going to see on the market are gloves like these driver's gloves. I pretty much only use these when I'm TIG welding, when I'm doing a welding process that doesn't throw a bunch of sparks my way. They're light, they're nimble, they're very flexible. Not something that I would recommend for stick or MIG though, just due to less protection. So make sure you get an appropriate set of gloves for doing this kind of work. And another thing that you're definitely going to want to pay attention to, get some safety glasses. Safety glasses are your friend when it comes to stick welding. You'll find out very quickly that stick welding has what's called slag on it, and you got to remove that slag. These safety glasses are meant to keep that slag out, because when you chip it away, that slag likes to go flying. And it is not fun when it gets into your eye. I have seen more than a few people get themselves taken to the ER because they shot a piece of hot slag into their eye. It's not fun. Don't give yourself a trip to the ER. Wear your safety glasses, all right? Now let's talk about some of the funner parts of stick welding, the actual sticks themselves. So right here, I've got kind of a bit of a variety pack. These are just some of the sticks that I have on hand. And we're going to kind of go through each one of them one by one and kind of explain what some of them are, where you want to use them, where you don't want to use them, etc., etc. So let's start with this stick. As you can see here, this stick has some numbers on the side, and they say 6011. These numbers are important. Make sure you pay attention to the numbers and which ones you're buying. They kind of correlate with the machine that you're using, so make sure you know which numbers you're buying and which machine likes these numbers. So this is a 1/8 inch 6011 rod. Very common, very well known, and very much used. The next stick here, they're flipped over there. That is a 7014. The main thing to look at is the number, not necessarily the E. All the E stands for is electrode. But this is a 7014 electrode. This one is a 3/32, and we'll kind of get into a little bit of what all the different sizes means when we set up the machines. But for now, just know that this is a 3/32 7014. Now these two rods actually share the same classification. See if I can get it in there. It is a 7018 rod. For the most part on this, don't mind the dash number or the extra numbers on the back. The main number that you want to focus on is that 7018. This one is an 1/8 inch 7018, and this one is another 7018, but it's a 5/32. Just get a little bit of comparison in there. And the big point on the sizes of rod is where you set your amperage on your machine. There's also some advantages and disadvantages to different size rods, but we'll cover that more when we get sitting down and ready to weld them. Okay, so here I've got a smorgasbord of information here. This is from one of my earlier takes, and then the camera messed up and I couldn't really get it all on camera, but we're going to use it anyway. So you guys will remember I was talking about a 6011 rod. So let's start kind of breaking that down. You'll notice I've got 6010 and 6013 over here. The concept that I'm going to show you on what all these numbers mean apply to pretty much any steel welding stick electrode. So let's get into what the numbers mean here. So 6011, that's one of the ones that we're going to be using. Come down here. This is kind of what it means. So starting with this 60, the first 2 or 3 numbers in your stick electrode are going to denote this down here. This is your tensile strength. So I've got a 60 up here. That stands for 60,000 pounds per square inch of tensile strength. The tensile strength is, you basically use it to determine about how strong your rod is. There's a couple other things in there, but we won't really worry about that. The main point is your 60 stands for 60,000 psi of tensile strength. The second number in there, this number, is a position weld. Most of the time you should see a 1 in there. There are a couple of different rods out there, but most of the time you're going to see a 1. Usually the rods that have a different number here, you have to special order or get them from a specified welding shop. So most of the time you're going to see a 1 here. 1 stands for all position. Now down here, let's kind of talk about all of that. So in that 3rd or 4th position, depending on what rod you have, you're either going to have a 1, 2, or a 3. Commonly, you'll see the 1. And that is an all position rod. That means you can run it flat, you can run it horizontal, and you can run it vertical. That's what that means. The other number that you'll sometimes see, and this is a little more common than the 3, but the 2. So this stands for a flat or horizontal only. Usually these rods are very high deposit rates, and their slag solidifies a little bit slower. So you want to run it flat or horizontal, but you don't want to run it vertical. That's what the 2 means. So pay attention to that. The third number that you'll see, and I've only really ever seen this number a handful of times, it's not very common, but it's good to know, is a 3. That means you are in a flat position only. Don't try welding it out of position, it is a flat only. It's usually a very high deposition rod, and it usually has a very slow cooling flux. And that's to allow the metal to really wet out and take a good hold. So very specialized welding scenarios where you will see a 3. Finally, back to our number. This last number here denotes your flux composition. There's all sorts of different fluxes out there, and a lot of them will kind of determine whether you can run this rod on a DC positive or an AC current. So if you have one of the AC buzz boxes, like the little Lincoln Electric buzz boxes, pay attention to what rods you get, because there are plenty of rods that will not run on AC, or they run really badly, they don't wet out properly, you'll be fighting your arc. So pay attention to this kind of last one, because that'll tell you a lot on whether or not you can run this machine, or this stick, excuse me, run this stick on AC, or if it is a DC only rod. So on the 6011, you'll note that I have it marked out that you can run it on AC. So if you guys are using a little buzz box, an AC buzz box, get a 6011, do not get the 6010. The 6010 is a DC only rod. There may be some variants out there that can run on AC, but for the purposes of trying to explain the everything you need to know to get started here, 6010 is a DC only rod. So if you have an AC buzz box, don't get the 6010. Get the 6011. That also is kind of the reason why I use 6011 more. Another number that I want you to know exists out there is this 6013. I'll be honest, I don't remember if the 6013 is a DC only rod or an AC. I'm pretty sure I've run it with AC, but don't quote me on that. Again, if you have the buzz box, get the 6011. 6013 is kind of an interesting rod. 6013 is primarily used as a training rod, especially in a whole bunch of schools. It runs pretty smooth, but it has pretty low penetration. It doesn't really dig into the metal to give you that deep penetration. Keep that in mind if you get a 6013 rod. I wouldn't use a 6013 rod for structurally sound stuff or things that you want to hold together a long time. You can, don't get me wrong, but for the most part, this 6013 rod ends up being a training rod in a lot of scenarios. Or it's for materials that are thin that you don't need a lot of penetration on. So keep that in mind on the 6013, because you'll probably see this rod when you go to buy sticks. There's usually a 6013 rod on the shelf. The 6010 and the 6011, however, get some deeper penetration. So if you've got something that needs to be full penetration, for those of you who are just starting out, if you got something that needs full penetration or needs to hold together a little bit better, go with the 6011 or the 6010. Now, the other rods that I had here were the 7018. You'll notice I've got a whole bunch of stuff written out on this as well. So let's start with the numbers again. Again, your first 2 or 3 numbers are going to denote the tensile strength. 7018 has a 70,000 pounds per square inch tensile strength. So it's a stronger rod than the 60s, the 60 series. However, 7018 doesn't quite flow as much as the 60 series. So commonly what you'll see happen is a lot of welders will use a 60 series rod to run in the root to get their two plates to join together, and then they'll run over that 60 series after they've cleaned it up with a 7018 to strengthen the joint, to make it a stronger weld. That's a very, very common practice that you'll find. So, 7018, 70,000 PSI tensile strength. The 1, again denoting that it is an all-position rod. You can run it flat, you can run it vertical. That's horizontal. You can run it horizontal, you can run it vertical. It's an all-position rod. And then the 8 denotes the flux composition. I remember off the top of my head that the 8 is a cellulose flux. So back in the old days, when they didn't know too much about flux, they would just wrap your rods in paper. And as the cellulose burned, it would create a shielding gas over the rod to give you some strong welds. Take a note on 7018. It is a DC only rod. For the purposes of learning, consider it a DC only rod. There are some rods out there that have a different notation on them that are meant to run with AC, but for the most part, just consider it a DC only rod. You'll thank yourself later. 7018 does not like to run on AC most of the time. And then the last one that we were talking about was the 7014. Again, same breakdown on the numbers as the 7018, but the 4 here denotes a titania flux, and most titania fluxes have iron powder in them. This iron powder makes it run very good for DC or AC. So if you have the AC only buzz box, make sure you get the 7014. Now you'll notice here that I've written down a 7024 here. I just kind of want to touch on this because there is a good possibility that you can see this rod when you're going out to buy stuff. 7024 is a pretty interesting rod. It runs a lot like a 7014, runs a lot like a 7018 as well, but it is considered a higher deposition rod. It puts down a little bit more metal than the 14 and the 18. So for this reason, because it's got more metal coming down, it is considered to only be used for a flat weld or a horizontal weld. So keep that in mind when you look at that. Remember, pay attention to that number. As you can see, the number 2 is a flat or horizontal only position. So pay attention to that. Okay, now that we've covered some of the sticks and their meanings and what to look for, let's talk about the machines. Now, as you can see here, I've got 2 machines here. This one is the AC buzz box that I keep telling you about. Mine's a Lincoln, and I believe most of them are Lincolns. I could be wrong, but mine's a Lincoln. This is the very, very common one that you'll see all the time. As you can see, it says AC 225. So, you can kind of see on the knob there, it'll go anywhere from 40 amps to 225 amps. And we'll get into why that 75 is circled in another video when we sit down and actually start welding with this thing. But this is the very common AC buzz box that you'll see. Mine's a little bit older. My grandpa left it for me, so we're going to put that to use. The other machine that I have here, this is an Everlast welder. And down here, you'll notice that it is a model Lightning MTS 225. I love this machine, and it stick welds in DC. So I want to kind of cover the DC welding side and the AC welding side. So we're going to do that in the next 2 videos, and we'll kind of talk about some of the differences. We'll get into some of the positions and all the other fun stuff that you need to know to just get started. So keep in mind that this first little series is just to help people get started with stick welding. And that will do it for this video. We'll see you in the next one, and we'll plan on running some beads.